Welcome aboard, traveller of the seven screens. You've just stepped onto our ship of stories, where history, myth, and imagination all sail under the same tattered flag. Before we hoist the sails and dive into the dark, churning world of real pirates, I want to know something about you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you tuning in from a quiet harbour at midnight, the glow of your phone lighting your face while the world sleeps? Or maybe from the other side of the globe, coffee in hand, sunlight pouring in as you set out on your own daily voyage? There's something magical about seeing how far and wide our crew stretches, from night owls to early risers, from one ocean of time zones to another. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never drift past another story again. Every week, we set sail through time, uncovering the forgotten, the forbidden, and the utterly fascinating tales that shaped our world. Whether it's the roaring age of piracy, the lost cities beneath the waves, or the whispers of empires that vanished into dust, this channel is your passport to the past. So go ahead, join our growing crew of curious minds. When you subscribe, you're not just watching, you're part of the voyage. Now take a breath. Feel the salt wind on your face. The deck beneath your feet creaks as the ship groans against the tide. Tonight, we sail into the true life of pirates, not the polished legends of Hollywood, but the raw, filthy, desperate reality of men who traded land for chaos and freedom for survival. The ocean is waiting. Let's begin. You probably imagine pirates as free spirits, sailing the open seas with the wind in their hair, shouting orders through the spray of salt water and clinking mugs of rum beneath the stars. But you wouldn't last a week among them. The truth is that the life of a pirate in the so-called golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, was a grinding existence of filth, hunger, disease, and paranoia. The sea was a cruel home, and the men who sailed upon it were its half-starved servants. If you were to step aboard a pirate ship, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the thrill of freedom, but the stench. The mixture of spoiled meat, human sweat, rotting rope, tar, bilge water, and the faint iron tang of dried blood. The deck would be slick, not from the romantic spray of ocean foam, but from grease, oil, and the refuse of a crew who had neither the time nor inclination for cleanliness. Below deck, the air was nearly unbreathable. Imagine a low-ceilinged wooden tunnel with little ventilation, packed with men who hadn't bathed in weeks. Tobacco smoke, mildew, and the musk of human decay formed a permanent fog. The hammocks hung close together, and the lice never left you alone. If you managed to sleep, it was to the sound of rats scurrying across the timbers, the only creatures truly at home there. Pirates often shared quarters with livestock, chickens, goats, and sometimes pigs. These animals provided fresh meat and eggs, but their droppings turned the decks into a noisome swamp. You might step barefoot into something warm in the dark and hope it was only chicken waste. Food was a torment in itself. Salted beef and pork were staples, but they were often so tough with age that men soaked them in seawater overnight just to make them chewable. Ship's biscuit, a kind of baked bread so hard it could last years, was home to weevils, small beetles that thrived in the warm, damp holds. Pirates didn't bother picking them out. They added protein. Water was precious, and after a few days at sea, it turned sour. In the tropics, the heat spoiled it faster. To mask the taste, rum was added, a practice that gave birth to the infamous reputation of pirates as drunkards. But more often than not, it wasn't celebration that drove them to drink. It was the only way to forget where they were. You would grow sick quickly. Every pirate did. Scurvy was the ever-present curse, bleeding gums, loose teeth, and skin that turned a sickly yellow before death. The cause, a lack of vitamin C, was not yet understood. Some pirates tried eating sauerkraut or citrus when they raided ships that carried them, but these moments of accidental health were rare. Other diseases were less mysterious. Dysentery spread through the ship like wildfire. The cramped quarters meant there was no privacy, no sanitation. The waste bucket in the corner of the hold was both a necessity and a horror. If you were unlucky, you'd sleep near it. Fevers came next. Malaria and yellow fever if you sailed the Caribbean, pneumonia and frostbite if you ventured north. Medical care was brutal. A pirate ship rarely carried a surgeon, and when it did, he was as dangerous as the diseases. Surgery meant amputation with a saw, cauterization with a red-hot iron, and no anesthesia. The lucky ones fainted. The unlucky ones screamed until their throats bled. Despite the filth and the fear, pirates did have something rare for their time: equality. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of naval ships or merchant vessels, pirates often voted on decisions. The captain was elected and could be removed if the crew lost confidence. Every man received a share of the loot, distributed by a written article or code. But this democracy didn't come from noble ideals. It was born from necessity. Life was so harsh and death so frequent that no one tolerated tyranny for long. The pirates' freedom was a survival pact, a recognition that cooperation was the only way to keep the ship from collapsing into chaos. Still, mutiny was never far away. The captain's authority was strong during battle but fragile afterward. A single bad decision, a storm misjudged, or a failed raid could end in his death, not by enemy hands, but by his own men. Every day had its rhythm, not of adventure, but of repetition. The men scrubbed the deck, repaired sails, tarred ropes, patched leaks, and baled water. The ship demanded constant attention, the sea punished neglect. When there was no target in sight, boredom gnawed at the crew. Days stretched into monotony, endless water, endless sky. Pirates gambled, sang shanties, or carved pieces of wood into crude charms. Some tattooed themselves using soot and gunpowder, marks of belonging, but also mementos in case they died nameless. Others stared at the horizon and thought of nothing, because thinking too long made the sea seem larger and more merciless. When battle finally came, it was chaos. Cannon fire split the air, deafening, choking with smoke and splinters. The smell of sulfur burned your nose. The deck shook as iron balls tore through wood and flesh alike. You might step over the body of a friend without noticing until your boot slipped on blood. Pirates preferred to board their prey rather than sink it. Ships were valuable, and so was everything aboard. They'd grapple the target, throw hooks and ropes, and swarm over the rails. Swords, pistols, axes, it was over fast and filthy. The goal wasn't honor, but survival. Afterward came the looting, then the hard question of what to do with prisoners. Some were ransomed, others were marooned, left on a barren island with a bottle of water and a pistol. A few were forced to join the crew, and some did so willingly, preferring the rough equality of pirates to the cruelty of naval discipline. The ocean was their world, but it was also their jailer. Storms were constant threats, walls of grey water that could tear apart a ship in minutes. Lightning struck the masts, ropes snapped like whips. If you fell overboard, you were gone, no one turned back for you. Days of calm were worse in some ways. The ship would drift, the sails limp, the sun merciless, water ran low, food spoiled, tempers frayed. Some men went mad staring at the horizon that never moved. Others whispered that they were cursed, and in truth, many of them were. Most pirates lived short lives. The average pirate career lasted less than 2 years. Capture meant hanging. The Royal Navy's noose was the final punctuation mark on a career built on desperation. Those who escaped execution often died of disease or starvation long before they could enjoy their spoils. What drove them to this life? Not the lure of gold, at least not at first. Most were former sailors, indentured servants, or escaped slaves. Life ashore offered no mercy, wages withheld, lashes for disobedience, and hunger at every turn. Piracy was rebellion against a world that had already condemned them. And yet, even in rebellion, they found themselves trapped in another system of suffering, a floating society where every mistake could kill you. You would have to learn to sleep with one eye open, to ration your water, to patch your wounds with salt and rags. You would learn to live among men who laughed at death because they saw it every day. The romantic image of pirates, the flags, the treasure maps, the buried gold, came later, when writers turned misery into myth. The real pirates didn't bury treasure, they spent it as fast as they could. Rum, women, and fleeting moments of comfort were all they wanted. They knew they wouldn't live long enough for savings to matter. Still, amid all the horror, there was something strangely human in their persistence. They kept the ship sailing, they sang in storms, they joked with death. Perhaps that's what makes their story unsettling. They remind us that even in the filthiest corners of history, people find a way to live, or at least to keep moving forward, one wave at a time. But as the ship drifts into the night and the creak of wood fades into the dark water, one question lingers. Was this life, this brutal, hungry existence at the edge of the world, truly freedom, or just another kind of prison? The sea, for all its endless motion, demands structure. Even chaos needs a captain. By the early 18th century, the so-called golden age of piracy had begun to lose its shine. The Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the coasts of West Africa swarmed with ships flying black flags. But behind those skull and crossbones banners lay an unexpected secret. Pirates were not anarchists, not truly. They had rules, more rules than many kings. They called them Articles of Agreement, the Pirate Code, if you prefer the more romantic name. But there was nothing romantic about them. These codes were born of necessity, of men trapped together on a floating coffin who needed a way to survive one another. Every pirate crew drafted its own set of articles, written down before the ship left port or before a new captain took command. They were read aloud to the entire crew, and every man signed or marked them, sometimes with a shaky X, sometimes with blood. The articles outlined everything: how loot was divided, how disputes were settled, what behavior was forbidden, and what punishments awaited those who broke the rules. Some examples survive, scratched in fading ink. Equal shares for all. The captain and quartermaster received extra portions, but never more than double the common sailors. Injury compensation. A man who lost a limb or an eye received payment, sometimes 100 pieces of 8, or the promise of extra shares for life. No gambling with dice or cards. Luck was dangerous enough at sea without tempting it. Lights out by 8 at night. Silence after that. No shouting, no drinking, no fights. No striking another crewman aboard ship. Disputes were settled ashore or under formal duel. You might expect thieves and killers to ignore such codes, but they were followed with surprising discipline. A ship at sea was a delicate thing, a floating city of 200 men with no escape. A single spark of conflict could sink them all. Pirates had learned from experience, years of abuse under navy captains and merchant masters. They had seen how power corrupted, so they invented their own kind of democracy, harsh but functional. The captain was not a king. His power was limited, checked by the quartermaster, who acted as the ship's second in command and the voice of the crew. In battle, the captain's word was law, but once the smoke cleared, authority shifted. The quartermaster handled discipline, divided loot, settled disputes, and represented the men's interests. If the captain made too many mistakes or grew too greedy, the crew could vote to remove him. It was government by survival, an early form of social contract. Everyone knew that the sea gave no second chances. Tyranny could sink a ship as surely as a storm. There's a reason some historians call the pirate ship the first floating republic. It wasn't liberty in the modern sense, but it was equality born of necessity. Every man aboard had a voice because every man aboard could die. Still, the pirates' democracy was a fragile thing. Brotherhood lasted only as long as the plunder did. Once the gold was gone, suspicion returned. A captured ship might bring in thousands of pieces of eight, jewels, spices, and barrels of sugar, wealth enough to make a man rich for life, if he could live long enough to spend it. But few did. The money went fast. Rum, women, gambling, and bribes to local governors burned through the fortune in days. Port towns like Nassau in the Bahamas or Port Royal in Jamaica became havens of brief ecstasy and long regret. Nassau was the most infamous of them all, a sand-swept settlement of broken ships and broken men known simply as the Pirate Republic. By 1715, Nassau was a ruin left behind by war. The British had abandoned it, the Spanish raided it, and the hurricanes finished the job. But for pirates, it was perfect. No law, no taxes, no masters, just a natural harbor and easy access to the shipping lanes of the Caribbean. Hundreds of pirates lived there, their ships anchored offshore like floating fortresses. They built crude huts from driftwood and canvas and traded stolen goods for food and drink. Here, pirates from every corner of the world mingled: English, Dutch, French, African, and Creole. Some were former slaves who had taken freedom at sword point, others were deserters from the navy. A few were women who disguised themselves well enough to survive among men who respected only strength. There was a kind of rough equality on those beaches. No one cared where you came from, only how you fought and whether you kept your word. In the smoky taverns, men who once would have killed each other for a flag now drank together under none. But the illusion of freedom couldn't last. The same lawlessness that made Nassau a haven also made it a target. The British Crown could ignore pirates for a time, especially when they preyed on Spain and France, England's rivals, but by the 1710s, piracy had grown too costly. Merchant companies complained, governors demanded protection, and the empire began to push back. In 1717, King George I issued a royal proclamation, a pardon for pirates. Any man who surrendered within a year would be forgiven and allowed to return to honest work. Those who refused would be hunted without mercy. For many, it was the beginning of the end. Some accepted. They laid down their weapons, walked into colonial ports, and begged for forgiveness. Others laughed and went back to sea. They had lived too long without masters to bend the knee again. Among the latter were men like Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, and Charles Vane, who ruled Nassau like warlords. Their ships became symbols of defiance, their flags warnings to every merchant vessel from Florida to Africa. But behind the legend there was fear. Supplies dwindled, storms wrecked ships faster than they could be replaced, disease swept through the harbor, and even among pirates, betrayal was easy currency. The fragile unity of the Pirate Republic began to fracture. Captains argued over spoils, crews deserted, and bounties rose. Colonial navies tightened their grip on the Caribbean, hunting pirate ships one by one. By 1718, the British sent Woodrow Rogers, a former privateer, to reclaim Nassau. His orders were clear: offer the king's pardon or hang those who refused. He arrived with warships and soldiers, and most pirates surrendered without a fight. They were tired of hunger, of heat, of running. Nassau's brief dream of freedom collapsed overnight. Those who resisted fled to sea. Some turned south to the Gulf of Mexico or West Africa. Others headed north toward the Carolinas, hoping to find shelter in the tangled coastlines. But there was no escape. The world was shrinking, empires were growing stronger, and the sea no longer belonged to outlaws. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was among the last to stand. He was not the monster later legends made him, though he cultivated fear like a weapon. He tied slow-burning fuses into his beard, lighting them before battle so his face glowed with smoke and sparks. His appearance was terrifying enough to make opponents surrender without a shot. But the real man was more careful than mad. He avoided unnecessary violence, preferred negotiation to slaughter, and knew that terror was more efficient than blood. In 1718, he briefly accepted the king's pardon, settling in North Carolina under the protection of corrupt officials who profited from his plunder. But idleness didn't suit him. Within months, he returned to piracy. That decision sealed his fate. The governor of Virginia sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard to hunt him down. The two met near Ocracoke Inlet in November 1718. The battle was brief and brutal. Blackbeard was shot 5 times, stabbed more than 20, and finally beheaded. His severed head was hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's ship as proof of victory. His body was thrown into the sea, where, according to rumor, it swam 3 times around the ship before sinking. With his death, the age of the great Caribbean pirates effectively ended. Within a few years, most of the infamous captains were dead or captured. Charles Vane was hanged in Jamaica. Calico Jack Rackham met the same fate in 1720. His lovers and crewmates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, were spared execution only because they were pregnant, though neither would live long afterward. By 1730, the last pirate havens were gone. The empire reclaimed the seas. Trade resumed, the navy grew stronger, and the pirates' brief experiment in floating democracy vanished into legend. Yet, oddly enough, the world didn't forget them. Writers and sailors passed down stories of the pirate code, of men who lived without masters, who shared their spoils equally and voted for their leaders. The details became blurred, the hardships softened, the lice and the hunger faded from memory, leaving only the romance of rebellion. But if you strip away the myth, something remarkable remains. For a few short years, ordinary sailors, men beaten and broken by empire, built their own form of justice on the open sea. They lived by rules they wrote themselves, enforced by the consent of all. It wasn't freedom in the modern sense, it was rough, temporary, and always at the edge of survival. But for men who had known nothing but tyranny, it was enough to make them fight and die for it. If you could stand on the deck of a pirate ship as dawn broke, if you could feel the cold wind and see the tired faces around you, you'd realize something quietly profound. They weren't heroes or villains, they were survivors. People who had traded one master for another, who mistook hardship for liberty because they'd never known true peace. The pirate's life was not a life of glory, it was a desperate negotiation with hunger, with fear, with the endless sea. But within that struggle, they carved out a tiny, flickering sense of dignity, the idea that even the lowest man had a voice, that the spoils of risk belonged to those who risked everything. And maybe that's why their legend still floats across the centuries. Not because of their cruelty, or their treasure, or their flags, but because they tried, in their own brutal way, to make a world where they mattered. Still, one question remains unanswered, echoing like the creak of a ship in the dark. If the pirate republic had survived, if those floating democracies had endured instead of sinking under empire, what kind of world might the seas have become? The age of the pirate ended not with a bang, but with the slow creak of a rope tightening around a neck. By the 1720s, the oceans that had once seemed boundless were shrinking under the growing reach of empire. The great pirate fleets were gone, their ships splintered and their flags buried in the archives of colonial governors. What remained was a grim parade of captured men. Haggard, filthy, sunburned, marched through jeering crowds toward the gallows. The same ports that had once secretly traded with them now turned them into spectacles. In London, Charleston, Port Royal, and Boston, people came to watch pirates hang. It was not just punishment, it was theatre. Executions were public events. The authorities wanted to make examples of the condemned to show that the empire had reclaimed its seas. Notices were printed days in advance, promising entertainment for the curious. On the morning of an execution, church bells rang. The condemned were led through the streets in chains, guarded by soldiers. Their faces were pale, their clothes tattered, their bodies often marked by years of malnutrition and disease. Some wept, others shouted defiance, many said nothing at all. In England, the most notorious sight was Execution Dock on the banks of the Thames in Wapping. There, for over 400 years, pirates and smugglers met their end. The condemned were hanged from a short rope designed to strangle slowly rather than snap the neck. The crowd would watch as the body convulsed, sometimes for 20 minutes, until finally still. The corpse was left hanging at low tide, and cut down only when the river rose to wash over it, a symbolic return to the sea. Then came the most haunting ritual of all, the gibbeting. A few pirates, particularly infamous captains, were coated in tar and hung in iron cages, displayed along the coast as a warning to others. Their bodies swung in the wind for years, until only bones remained. Travellers reported the rattling sound of chains in the night, like ghostly bells calling from the shore. The message was clear. Piracy was finished. And yet, even as they died, their stories began to grow. Ordinary people, especially sailors, were fascinated by pirates. They were enemies of the crown, but also enemies of the same cruel system that oppressed the poor. The line between criminal and hero was thin, blurred by desperation. Ballads and pamphlets began to circulate, retelling the final words of hanged pirates. Some were repentant, warning others to avoid their fate. Others were defiant, cursing their captors and declaring that death was better than servitude. These words, true or invented, spread quickly through taverns and docksides. A dead pirate could become a kind of folk hero, proof that someone, somewhere, had stood up to power, even if it ended in a noose. By the mid-18th century, the pirate's transformation was well underway. The pamphlets became chapbooks, and chapbooks became novels. The most famous was a general history of the Pirates, published in 1724 under the pseudonym Captain Charles Johnson. No one knows who Johnson really was, possibly a sailor, possibly even Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. Whoever he was, he gathered the stories of more than 100 pirates. Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, Mary Red, Bartholomew Roberts, and turned them into characters larger than life. Johnson's book blended fact and fiction so seamlessly that it shaped everything we still think of as pirate culture punisher. The black flag, the buried treasure, the yo-ho-ho swagger. The real pirates, of course, had no treasure maps, no polished speech, no grand adventures. But myth travels farther than truth, and it never sleeps in the mud. By the 1800s, the pirate had been reborn, not as a criminal, but as a romantic rebel. Painters and writers recast them as noble outlaws, symbols of freedom on the high seas. The horrors of disease and hunger faded from memory, the gallows disappeared behind the glow of moonlit adventure. In 1822, Lord Byron published The Corsair, a poem about a handsome pirate who fights tyranny and rescues a woman from captivity. It sold out its first printing in a single day. By the Victorian era, children's books carried the legend further. Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in 1883, turned the pirate into a figure of fascination and fun. Long John Silver, with his crutch and parrot, became the template for every cinematic pirate to come. The black flag, the Jolly Roger, became an emblem of freedom rather than terror. its skull and crossed bones, once a warning of imminent death, transformed into a playful symbol. The sea itself, once a place of despair, became a stage for imagination. It's easy to forget that behind those stories lay the real world of the 17th and 18th centuries, an age when most sailors were barely better than slaves, when nations waged endless wars for sugar and gold, and when hunger was as constant as the tide. The pirates we remember were born from that cruelty. Their freedom was not a choice of adventure but of necessity, a rebellion by the unwanted, the unpaid, and the unfree. Even their supposed democracy was born not from idealism but from exhaustion. When you live in a world where death is constant, equality becomes the only sensible law. And yet, in their own bleak way, they left an imprint. The pirate code, that insistence on fair shares and consent of the governed, reflected ideas that would soon echo in revolutions on land. Historians have even drawn parallels between pirate councils and the early democratic assemblies of America. The idea that all men have a say, that leadership depends on consent, those were radical thoughts in an age of kings. Of course, pirates never intended to inspire constitutions, they just wanted to survive. But sometimes, survival itself is a revolution. What survives of piracy today is mostly language and legend. The word buccaneer, once a term for rough Caribbean hunters who smoked meat on open fires, now conjures images of daring sword fights. Black spot walk the plank, dead man's chest, all inventions of writers long after the last real pirate was gone. But if you look closely, you can still see traces of their world in ours. Modern maritime law, the concept of universal jurisdiction, meaning pirates could be punished by any nation, began in that era. It marked one of the first steps toward international justice. The same logic later applied to crimes like slavery and war crimes. And the fascination endures. Every generation rediscovers the pirate, reshaping him to fit its own dreams. In the 20th century, film turned them into icons. Captain Blood 1935, Black Swan 1942, and later Pirates of the Caribbean transformed the noose into a necklace, the stench into swagger. The sea, which once devoured men, now sparkles under Hollywood lights. The wooden decks are clean, the rum sweet, the danger rehearsed. But perhaps that's how myths work. They take what was unbearable and make it beautiful. Even so, the ghosts remain. Along the coastlines of the Caribbean and the Carolinas, legends persist of phantom ships seen at dusk, sails black against the sunset, moving silently against the wind. Locals swear they hear distant cannon fire or the echo of men singing across the water. In the Bahamas, divers still find fragments of iron and wood buried beneath the coral. In some places, the bones of the hanged lie under the sand, their names long lost to history. Every artifact tells the same quiet truth, that freedom, for those men, was never about glory, it was about breathing one more day without a master. The pirates' lives were short, their ends brutal, their victories fleeting. But in a world ruled by empires and merchants, they were the only ones who dared to say, even for a moment, that the sea belonged to no one. If you could stand now on the shore where Execution Dock once stood, you'd see the grey Thames flowing past, calm and indifferent. The crowds are gone, the gallows have rotted away. But somewhere in that cold water lies the memory of a man who once believed he was free. And maybe that's the final irony. The pirates were doomed, not because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient, proof that the world could be organized differently, however briefly. They wanted what every person wants: control over their own lives, a share of what they risked for, and a voice that mattered. The sea, in all its indifference, offered them that, and then took it back. Today, Their faces grin from movie posters and theme park rides, stripped of hunger and fear. We celebrate the mask, but forget the man behind it. Still, when the night is quiet and the tide rolls in, you might imagine the faint creak of timbers and the whisper of wind through rigging. It's only the sea, but it sounds a little like laughter. A reminder, perhaps, that freedom, even doomed freedom, never truly sinks. And so ends the first story. The pirates are gone, the gallows silent, and the waves eternal. You would not have liked the smell, before the age of stone castles and shining knights, before parchment laws and printed Bibles. Most of Europe was mud. If you lived then, around the 12th century, you would wake not to birdsong or bells, but to the sound of animals moving in the dark corners of your hut. The air was thick with smoke, the floor packed with dirt, and the faint warmth came not from a hearth, but from the body heat of pigs and goats. You were a peasant, which meant you were neither free nor truly enslaved, something in between. The Latin word was villanus, meaning man of the villa or of the estate. It later became villain in English, and not by accident. To the nobles, you were little more than a creature tied to the soil, rough, ignorant, expendable. But you had no time for such thoughts. Dawn was coming, and the Lord's fields waited. Your days followed the seasons, and the seasons never stopped. In spring you ploughed and sowed. In summer you weeded, harvested and sweated until your back locked into a permanent curve. Autumn meant threshing and storing what you had managed to grow. Winter was hunger. The Lord owned the land, and you worked it for him. Out of every bushel of grain you produced, part went to his storehouse, part to the church, and what remained, if anything, kept you alive. The taxes came in many names, tithes, rents, corvée labour, but the meaning was always the same. You paid, and you paid again. A tenth of your produce went to God through the local priest. Another portion went to the bailiff who collected dues for your lord. You might owe him days of unpaid labour, helping to build a fence or repair his road. If you had chickens, he might claim one as rent. If you had daughters, he might demand a wedding fee when they married. Money was rare. Most payments were in kind, eggs, wool, grain, or labour. When coin did appear, it was often clipped, worn, or counterfeit. And always, behind every transaction, loomed the threat of the reeve, a fellow villager appointed to enforce the Lord's rights. He knew every acre of land, every tool, every hidden loaf of bread. If you tried to cheat, he would know. The medieval village was both your cage and your world. It might contain 50 to 100 people, all bound by birth, marriage, and necessity. Beyond its thatched roofs stretched open fields divided into long strips, narrow ridges of earth that each family worked. You could not fence your land, the whole community shared it. The rhythm of the village was the rhythm of survival. The bell from the church, if your village had one, marked the hours of work and prayer. The priest, one of the few who could read, was your connection to heaven and to the Lord's authority. At the centre stood the manor house, usually of stone, its walls towering above your wooden hut. The Lord rarely stayed long. He preferred the comfort of other estates or wars in distant lands, but his presence lingered in the rules that governed everything. If your ox strayed into his meadow, you were fined. If your child stole apples from his orchard, you paid twice their worth. If your fire spread and burned his timber, your entire family could be ruined. Your home was one room, maybe two if you were lucky. The walls were wattle and daub, sticks woven together and smeared with a mix of clay, dung and straw. The roof was thatched, alive with insects. There was no chimney. Smoke from the hearth filled the room before escaping through a hole in the roof, darkening everything with soot. The bed was a heap of straw shared by the family. Fleas and lice were constant companions. You wore the same clothes day and night, rough wool in winter, linen in summer if you could afford it. Bathing was rare, partly because water was cold and dangerous, partly because few thought it important. Dirt was as natural as skin. Your diet was monotony itself. Bread, onions, and ale were your staples. Meat was rare, and milk often spoiled before it could be drunk. On fast days, nearly half the year by church decree, you could not eat animal products. You learned to make thin soups from peas, barley, and whatever herbs grew nearby. The hunger months, late winter to early spring, were the worst. The old stores ran low, and the new crops were not yet ready. Families ate bark, weeds, or boiled nettles to survive. Some dug up the graves of livestock for scraps of fat. When illness came, you endured it. Doctors were for nobles. For everyone else, there were prayers, herbs, and superstition. A fever might be blamed on bad air or on sin. A wound could be treated with a poultice of moss or pig fat. Childbirth was perilous. Many women died before age 30. Infants were baptized as soon as possible, not for joy, but for fear that they might die unshriven. The church was both comfort and control. It gave meaning to suffering, teaching that the poor would find reward in heaven if they accepted their place on earth. The priest preached obedience, but he also blessed the fields and prayed for rain. Life revolved around holy days, holidays in the literal sense. Feasts of saints, harvest festivals, and market fairs offered rare moments of relief. You drank, sang, and forgot for a while that you were a servant of both God and man. But the world outside the village was dangerous. Bandits roamed the roads and wolves stalked the forests. A broken tool or a sick ox could mean ruin, and always there were taxes more each year. Sometimes soldiers arrived, first the king's, then his enemies, then both again. They took what they wanted: grain, animals, daughters. To them, you were neither subject nor ally, just a source of food and shelter. When war passed, plague often followed. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing 1 in every 3 people. Villages vanished overnight. But even before that, smaller waves of sickness, typhoid, dysentery, ergot poisoning, haunted every generation. You would not have understood the cause. You would have buried your dead quickly, perhaps with a simple wooden cross, and moved on because the fields still needed ploughing. Everything you did, every breath, was under the shadow of your Lord. You owed him not only taxes but fealty, a solemn promise of obedience. If he called you to labor or to war, you went. If he demanded your grain, you gave it. In return, he was supposed to protect you from raiders, from famine, from injustice. But often, he was the one you needed protection from. The manor court was his instrument. There, beneath the open sky, disputes were settled: who owned which strip of field, who stole whose chicken, who failed to attend Sunday Mass. The fines were small but constant, and the reeve never forgot a debt. Still, you endured. You had no choice. And there was a kind of peace in routine. The world changed slowly, too slowly for most to notice. Children were born, crops grew, people aged and died. The same plough you used had been used by your grandfather and would be used by your son. Time for a peasant was circular, an endless loop of planting, reaping, and praying. It would be easy to call this life misery, and in many ways it was, but it was also resilience. The peasants of medieval Europe survived centuries of war, plague, and famine. They built cathedrals they would never enter, worked fields they did not own, and kept alive the rhythms of civilization while kings played at conquest. Their patience was the foundation upon which everything else stood. Without them, the castles would have crumbled, the monasteries would have starved, and the markets would have emptied. You might say they lived invisible lives, but they were the reason life continued at all. And yet, as the centuries wore on, something began to shift. The population grew, trade expanded, coins began to circulate more freely. Slowly, quietly, the balance between lord and peasant began to tremble. Some peasants bought their freedom, others fled to towns, where new work awaited, weaving, smithing, selling. The lords demanded more, but the people had begun to learn that not all chains were unbreakable. The soil that had bound them for generations began to loosen. Still, one question lingered in the hearts of those who remained. If life beneath the Lord's rule was ordained by God, as the priest claimed, then why did God seem to favor the lords so much more than the peasants? If life under the Lord's shadow was endless toil, it was also a slow-burning tension. For centuries, peasants lived with the knowledge that the world was not just indifferent, it was actively hostile. Every year brought new levies, new tithes, and new labor obligations. Every generation handed down the same debts, the same expectations, the same tools. Yet human nature has a way of testing limits. When oppression becomes unbearable, even the most patient will act. Much of peasant resistance was subtle. You might imagine grand uprisings, banners waving, swords flashing. But for most peasants, rebellion began with small acts, the theft of firewood, the hiding of grain, a pig slaughtered in secret. Children were taught to miscount eggs or accidentally break a plowshare. Labor could be delayed, ostensibly out of fatigue, illness, or broken tools, and the reeve would shake his head, suspicious but powerless to punish everyone at once. The lords tolerated some mischief. It was expected. Too much cruelty or greed, however, risked widespread unrest, and peasants knew the rules of survival. Protest too openly, and the punishment could be swift; protest too silently, and life remained unbearable. Even work itself became a form of resistance. Crops were planted late, weeds allowed to flourish, harvests subtly diminished. A poor yield meant the lord's granaries suffered as much as your stomach, reminding him that his power depended on your labor. Eventually, defiance escalated. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe saw repeated peasant uprisings, some minor, some catastrophic. In England, France, Germany, and Italy, villages rose in anger against lords, taxes, and the grinding weight of feudal law. One famous example is the Jacquerie of 1358 in France. After the devastation of the Hundred Years' War and the plague, peasants faced starvation, excessive taxes, and roving mercenary bands that pillaged at will. Frustration boiled over. The uprising began in northern France. Thousands of peasants armed themselves with farm tools, pitchforks, and axes. They attacked manor houses, burned records of debts, and killed officials. For a brief time, it seemed the world might shift. But the revolt was crushed with merciless speed. Knights on horseback, trained in war and brutality, descended on the unarmed farmers. Villages were burned, survivors were executed publicly, the leaders were tortured and displayed as warnings. Even when crushed, these revolts left marks, not only in the memory of oppression, but in subtle changes to law and taxation over the following decades. Lords became slightly more cautious, peasants slightly more clever. Perhaps the best-known peasant uprising occurred in England, a few decades after the Black Death. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 began with a new tax, the poll tax, designed to raise money for war against France. It was steep, regressive, and felt like a direct attack on ordinary people. Rebellion erupted first in Essex and Kent. Poor villagers, already struggling after plague and labor shortages, refused to pay. Their protests escalated. They burned official buildings, attacked tax collectors, and marched toward London. Led by figures such as Wat Tyler, a man whose origins were humble and whose leadership grew out of necessity, the rebels demanded relief from serfdom, lower taxes, and the enforcement of fair laws. For a moment, the capital seemed vulnerable. Thousands of peasants poured into the streets. Officials panicked. The king, Richard II, a boy of 14, met with the rebels, promising reforms he never intended to keep. The revolt ended violently. Wat Tyler was killed during negotiations, the rebellion collapsed, and thousands were executed in the aftermath. But the uprising demonstrated a harsh truth. Even the most tightly controlled feudal system could be shaken by collective action. Not every act of rebellion ended in open warfare. Peasants also resisted through migration. After the Black Death, labor shortages gave peasants leverage. Many left their villages to seek better conditions in towns or on different estates. Others negotiated wages, demanded money instead of labor, and forced lords to offer better conditions. Even small victories were meaningful. A lord might grant a week off for harvest, allow a widow to keep her land, or reduce a fine. These concessions were survival mechanisms, both for peasants and for lords who relied on their labor. Amid these acts of defiance, daily survival remained relentless. Work from dawn to dusk, weather permitting. Summers brought sunstroke and heat exhaustion, winters brought frostbite and frozen crops. Grain rotted in storage or was stolen. Floods destroyed fields. Fire swept through thatched villages. Children began working as soon as they could walk. Boys helped in the fields, learned trades, or tended animals. Girls helped in the home, cooked, cleaned, and cared for younger siblings. Education was rare, literacy almost non-existent. Knowledge of survival was passed orally, from parent to child. Hunger was a constant companion. Bread made from rye or barley was heavy and coarse. Meat was rare. The church forbade eating certain foods on fasting days, even if a family went hungry. Ale was often safer than water. Water could carry disease, while ale's fermentation killed bacteria. Illness continued to stalk villages. Typhoid, dysentery, and leprosy were common. Epidemics could sweep through a village, killing half the population in weeks. Illness continued to stalk villages. Typhoid, dysentery, and leprosy were common. Epidemics could sweep through a village, killing half the population in weeks. Midwives and herbalists treated wounds and sicknesses with what they could find: honey, herbs, moss, or boiled water. Magic and superstition were as common as medicine. Even when revolts flared, the lord's authority remained pervasive. You could not simply walk away from your obligations. Escaping serfdom often meant fleeing to a town and living under the protection of a charter, if the town welcomed you. Running away was dangerous. A lord could pursue fugitives with armed men, recover property, and impose severe punishments. The manorial court was another reminder. Even minor disputes, a quarrel over a field, a pig, or a neighbour's fence, could be brought before the lord's reeve. Punishments were public and humiliating: whipping, fines, or forced labour. Fear ensured obedience. But fear was never absolute. It was a negotiation. Lords depended on peasants to survive. Peasants depended on lords for protection. Every confrontation, every revolt, every subtle act of resistance was a negotiation for dignity and survival. The truth is, medieval peasants lived at the edge of human endurance. Few survived into old age. Women often died in childbirth or from chronic malnutrition. Men's lives were marked by back-breaking labour and early death from disease or accident. Children faced the same dangers from birth, with little to cushion them. Yet, despite the misery, humanity persisted. Families clung together, traditions endured, and communities survived. People sang, celebrated, prayed, and hoped. They found joy in small things: a good harvest, a shared loaf, a moment of warmth in a bitter winter. The peasant's life was brutal, repetitive, and relentless, but it was also the foundation upon which the medieval world rested. Without their labour, towns could not grow, armies could not march, and the lords would have starved in their castles. Even as revolts were crushed, taxes raised, and lords reasserted control, the seeds of change had been sown. The peasants of the Middle Ages were never truly free, yet they survived centuries of hardship, disease, and oppression. Their quiet defiance, small acts of resistance, and occasional uprisings hinted at a slow shift, one that would eventually reshape Europe. But one question remains, quietly troubling. How far could they push before the system broke? And what would happen if the lords, too, ever faltered in their authority? The life of a medieval peasant was a constant negotiation with inevitability. You toiled in fields that were not yours, paid taxes that never seemed fair, and survived under lords who treated your labour as entitlement rather than life's necessity. And yet, for all the suffering, you endured, not just individually, but collectively, shaping the slow rhythm of history through persistence, resistance, and occasional revolt. This section follows the long shadow of those lives, the ripple effects of revolt, and the quiet transformation of a social system that seemed eternal. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Europe's feudal system began to show cracks. Several factors converged. 1. The Black Death. In 1347-1351, the plague killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. Labour became scarce, fields went untilled. Lords suddenly realized that without the peasants, the estates could not function. Wages rose in many regions, sometimes dramatically, because workers could demand better terms. 2. Demographic shifts. Survivors migrated to towns in search of better work. They learned trades, negotiated wages, and developed networks outside the lord's control. Urban centres slowly gained economic power, offering alternatives to traditional feudal bonds. 3. Legal and political changes. Monarchs began consolidating authority, weakening the intermediary power of lords. In some regions, laws emerged that codified the rights of peasants, limiting excessive exploitation. While progress was uneven and often short-lived, it marked a departure from centuries of absolute lordship. The combination of plague, migration, and legal reform meant that serfdom, once a near-absolute condition, gradually loosened. By the 16th century, peasants in much of Western Europe had more autonomy. They could rent land, negotiate leases, and in some cases move freely without permission. The uprisings of the 13th and 14th centuries were often crushed, but they left lasting impressions. Consider the English peasants' revolt of 1381. On the surface, it ended in failure. Wat Tyler was killed, and executions followed. But the crown quickly became cautious. The poll tax that triggered the revolt was never collected again in the same way. Lords learned that excessive cruelty, or taxation, could provoke dangerous unrest. Similarly, in France, the Jacquerie may have been brutally suppressed, but it demonstrated the potential collective power of peasants. By the 15th century, the French monarchy began instituting more centralized authority, partly to control peasant unrest directly, bypassing potentially abusive local lords. Even minor acts of defiance, delaying work, hiding grain, fleeing to towns, accumulated over generations. They forced lords to adjust expectations, improve living conditions marginally, and tolerate negotiation. Survival, after all, was mutual. The peasants needed land to work, the lords needed labour to sustain the estates. While revolts captured attention, most survival occurred quietly. Adaptation. Peasants learned to manage risk. They stored grains in hidden caches, rotated crops to preserve fertility, and raised animals that could survive harsh winters. They developed shared labour systems, like gathering teams for planting and harvesting, allowing efficiency without depending entirely on the lord. Community support. Families relied on kinship networks. Villages pooled resources during famines or epidemics, borrowing grain, lending tools, and caring for orphans. Festivals and religious rituals doubled as mechanisms for social cohesion, ensuring mutual assistance in times of scarcity. Negotiation. Peasants became adept at navigating legal frameworks. They petitioned courts, appealed for relief, and sometimes leveraged the king's authority against abusive local lords. This slow, quiet negotiation often secured better terms than open revolt ever could. Migration. Perhaps the most important survival strategy was mobility. Villagers moved to towns, cities, or other estates seeking work or escape from oppression. Migration enabled economic improvement, exposure to new ideas, and gradual erosion of rigid feudal hierarchies. Women bore the brunt of survival. They managed households, prepared food, tended gardens, and helped in the fields. Childbirth was perilous, yet women continued the cycle of labor and reproduction that ensured continuity of peasant life. Girls were educated in survival skills, sewing, cooking, weaving, herbal remedies, while boys learned farming, tool repair, and animal husbandry. Knowledge was practical, oral, and communal, passed down from one generation to the next. Women also engaged in subtle resistance. They might refuse demands, hide food, or influence the distribution of work. In some cases, women took leadership in revolts or defended their families during uprisings. Their labor and judgment were critical to both survival and small-scale resistance. The church dominated peasant life, enforcing moral codes and social order, yet it was not entirely oppressive. Monks and priests offered education, charity, and medical knowledge, albeit limited. Religious rituals gave structure to suffering, offering hope that life's injustice might be reconciled in the afterlife. Peasants prayed for rain, good harvests, and health. They celebrated saints' days, often with dancing and feasting, that offered rare relief from labor. Even in misery, faith provided a framework for endurance. Still, religion could reinforce inequality. The tithe extracted a tenth of production. Moral teachings emphasized obedience to superiors. Every mass, confession, and blessing reinforced the hierarchy of life under feudalism. Serfdom and feudal dependence did not vanish overnight. Even in the 16th century, many peasants remained tied to land, paying dues and labor obligations. But the foundation had shifted. Labor shortages empowered workers, markets expanded, and towns offered alternative livelihoods. Revolts, though suppressed, demonstrated collective strength. Acts of quiet defiance taught new generations to negotiate, to hide, to flee, or to bargain, all skills that gradually undermined rigid social control. By the 17th century, Western Europe saw a marked decline in serfdom. Countries like England and France transitioned to tenant farming, wage labor, and more flexible land tenure. Peasants gained autonomy, literacy slowly spread, and migration allowed economic mobility. In Eastern Europe, feudal structures persisted longer, but even there, revolts and demographic pressures slowly eroded absolute lordship. The seeds planted centuries earlier were growing, quietly, without ceremony. The most remarkable aspect of the peasant experience is not revolt, taxation, or famine. It is resilience. Centuries of hardship, endless labor, disease, and violence did not erase community, family, or culture. Peasants sang, danced, and prayed. They built modest homes, cultivated fields, and maintained villages against the odds. Even the smallest victories, negotiating a lower fine, hiding a portion of harvest, or escaping to a town, were triumphs of ingenuity, courage, and persistence. Their survival shaped Europe. It made the economy resilient, towns viable, and agricultural innovation possible. It set the stage for the slow emergence of modern society, where mobility, negotiation, and the value of labor could challenge the authority of the powerful. The medieval peasant lived a life we can scarcely imagine. Hunger, disease, exhaustion, and oppression were constants. Yet even in the bleakest circumstances, people found ways to survive through community, cunning, rebellion, and endurance. Their story is a reminder that history is not only shaped by kings, generals, or battles, it is shaped by the quiet, relentless persistence of ordinary people who, day after day, carved meaning from suffering. You can read chronicles of war, taxation, and revolt and think of peasants only as victims. But they were far more than that. They were negotiators of survival, architects of endurance, and the slow, grinding force behind social change. Even in their mud, toil, and fear, they left a mark, a human imprint that would shape centuries of European life. And yet, after all this, one lingering question remains, quietly gnawing at the edges of history. How much suffering can a system endure before those it oppresses reshape it, or destroy it entirely? If you were born in the Roman Empire around the 1st century CE, you might dream of glory, chariots, triumphs, and honor. But if you were a Roman soldier, the reality was much less glamorous. You would rise before dawn, the chill of the morning air biting through your tunic, and lace on sandals meant for marching hundreds of miles, not comfort. Your helmet would chafe your forehead. Your armor would weigh down your shoulders, and the smell of metal, sweat, and unwashed bodies would hang around you like a constant fog. The Roman legion was a machine of discipline. Every day was ordered with precision, and deviation was punished harshly. Mornings began with inspection. The centurion would march down the line, checking armor, weapons, and hygiene. Even a missing pin or frayed strap could bring flogging. Soldiers polished their equipment constantly, not for vanity, but for survival. Rusted armor could fail in battle, and weapons could break at the worst moment. Breakfast was simple, a porridge of wheat or barley, sometimes mixed with water or milk. Meat was rare, bread was rationed, and wine, when available, was watered down. Meals were eaten quickly, often standing, while the centurions watched to ensure no soldier lingered. After breakfast came training, often twice a day. Soldiers practiced formations, thrusting with wooden swords, and marching in step, sometimes for miles with full equipment. The famous Roman testudo, or tortoise formation, required intense coordination. One misstep, and the whole line could collapse under enemy fire. If your legion was on campaign, you would march constantly. Roman soldiers carried everything: weapons, armor, rations, cooking tools, stakes for fortifications, and often a sling or javelin. The total load could reach 60–90 pounds. You marched 10, 15, sometimes 20 miles a day, rain, shine, or snow. At night, you built fortifications, ditches, palisades, and camp defenses. You slept in tents or under the stars, in cold, damp, or muddy conditions. Mosquitoes, lice, and rats were constant companions. And the road never ended. Rome demanded expansion, patrol, and conquest. Soldiers were sent to deserts, forests, mountains, and rivers. In Germania, they faced freezing winters and marshes. In Britain, they waded through mud for weeks. In the deserts of the Middle East, they baked under the sun. Every step, every night, every march was a test of endurance, not only against the enemy, but against the body itself. Discipline was absolute. The Roman army thrived on fear, reward, and conformity. Soldiers who fell asleep on duty, shirked labor, or failed to obey orders faced harsh penalties. Minor offenses were punished with lashes. Repeated or serious offenses could result in decimation, the execution of 1 in every 10 soldiers of a unit chosen by lot. The survivors were forced to watch, a constant reminder of the price of failure. Even during battle, discipline mattered more than bravery. A soldier who broke formation endangered the legion, and survival depended on cohesion, not heroism. The famous Roman formations, manipular lines, cohort units, testudo shields, were only effective when every soldier followed orders perfectly. Combat was only part of a soldier's life. When not fighting, you built roads, bridges, aqueducts, and forts. Roman engineering was legendary, but it was built on the backs of soldiers forced to work long hours under supervision. You might dig ditches, quarry stone, or carry timber for miles. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and blisters were constant companions. Tools were heavy, injuries frequent, and medical care primitive. Infection was more deadly than the enemy. The Roman soldier's life was a relentless cycle of labor, marching, training, and standing watch. Glory, if it came, arrived after decades of hardship, and many never survived long enough to see it. Beyond the physical, there was the mental burden. Soldiers were constantly at the mercy of their superiors, the terrain and the whims of fate. Battles were violent, chaotic, and often confusing. Losing a unit or breaking formation could mean death for everyone around you. Isolation from family added to the strain. Soldiers could be stationed hundreds of miles from home for years. Letters rare and slow. Friendships within the legion were crucial, but loss was constant. Disease, accident, and enemy attacks claimed comrades daily. Even in camp, danger was near. Raiders, bandits, and hostile locals could strike at night. Camps had to be fortified constantly, and standing guard was exhausting but unavoidable. Your diet was basic but functional. Grain was your staple: wheat, barley, or millet, boiled into a porridge or baked into hard biscuits called buccellatum. Meat was a luxury, usually provided in small amounts after victories or special provisions. Vegetables, olive oil, and wine supplemented calories when available. Rations were calculated to keep soldiers alive and marching, not healthy or strong. Malnutrition was common, and scurvy could strike on long campaigns when fresh produce was unavailable. Soldiers learned to improvise, scavenging herbs, roots, or wild game when possible. Water was sometimes scarce, contaminated, or stagnant. Soldiers drank wine diluted with water, safer than untreated sources, but still a risk. Dehydration, dysentery, and fevers were frequent killers on campaigns. The Roman army moved with impressive organization, but camp life was harsh. Soldiers dug ditches and built palisades daily. Watch rotations meant sleep was always interrupted. Tents offered minimal shelter. Mud, rain, and vermin permeated every corner. Discipline extended to camp hygiene. Latrines had to be dug, waste buried, and firewood collected. Failure to maintain these standards could lead to punishment or disease outbreaks. Illness spread quickly. Typhoid, dysentery, and fevers could decimate units faster than combat. Despite the hardships, camaraderie existed. Soldiers shared stories, sang songs, and practiced rituals to maintain morale. Tattoos or marks identified unit loyalty. Comradeship was not optional, it was survival. The only real incentives were status and future security. Legionaries who survived 25 years of service received a pension, often a plot of land or a cash sum, and sometimes Roman citizenship if they were auxiliaries. For many, this reward justified the misery. It was a chance to leave a lasting mark on the empire, to retire with some dignity, and to pass on benefits to one's family. But for the majority, those 25 years were a grind of mud, sweat, and relentless obedience. It's easy to think of Roman soldiers as heroic figures, but in reality, most were young men, often pressed or recruited from the lower classes, who endured a level of suffering that would be unimaginable today. They marched in blisters, carried enormous loads, fought in brutal battles, and slept exposed to the elements. Many died not in combat, but from exhaustion, disease, or accident. Their personal glory was rare, and their deaths often unrecorded, just names on a distant scroll. The Legion, the Empire, and the roads you still hear about today were built on these back-breaking realities. Every mile of road, every aqueduct, every fort, every battlefield was a testament to endurance more than heroism. If you stood on a Roman road today, imagining the thousands of soldiers who marched over it, you might picture glory. But think of the aches, the hunger, the mud, the constant oversight, the never-ending labor, and the fear. This was not a life of adventure. It was survival under impossible conditions. Discipline, order, and repetition ruled, and yet, somehow, the Legion endured, expanded, and created one of history's greatest empires. Still, one question lingers. Could any ordinary human truly endure the endless cycle of marching, digging, fighting, and surviving for decades without losing more than just their youth, perhaps their very sense of themselves? If you survived the daily grind of camp life, inspections, and endless marches, your real test had only just begun the campaign. For a Roman soldier, campaigns were not rare events. They were long, grueling sequences of movement, fortification, and combat. And while the history books glorify victories and triumphs, the reality was a slow, exhausting, and often brutal struggle against nature, disease, and human foes alike. Campaigns began with long marches. A legion could move 15-20 miles a day, often over rough, unfamiliar terrain. Roads were sometimes well built, but frequently they were mud, rocks, and forests. Mountains, rivers, and swamps slowed progress, increased fatigue, and raised the risk of injury. You carried all your equipment, weapons, armor, tent, tools, rations. The total could weigh upwards of 60-90 pounds. Every footstep wore down your sandals, blisters became infected, muscles strained, and fatigue set in long before you reached your destination. If you thought the day ended when the sun set, you were wrong. Soldiers dug camps, ditches, palisades, and watchtowers, then stood guard through the night. Sleep was short, uncomfortable, and often interrupted by the noise of animals, wind, or distant threats. Camps were miniaturized versions of military order. Barracks did not exist. Soldiers slept in tents or open ground. Hygiene was minimal. Latrines were dug in the soil, water often contaminated. Disease spread quickly. Typhoid, dysentery, and fevers were frequent killers, sometimes wiping out more men than battle. Food was monotonous. Grain, porridge, salted meat, and occasionally fresh supplies scavenged from local villages. If the campaign extended long enough, soldiers scoured the land for whatever they could eat: roots, herbs, small game, and sometimes looted livestock. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological pressure was constant. Fear of attack, uncertainty about terrain, and concern for comrades created persistent stress. Comradeship was vital. Without it, survival odds dropped sharply. When battle came, the regimented discipline of the legion was both salvation and constraint. Romans fought in formations that demanded perfect coordination. You could not act on instinct alone. To break formation meant death, either from the enemy or from fellow soldiers whose shields you endangered. The testudo formation, for example, relied on soldiers locking shields above and around them to form an armored shell. It was effective, but exhausting, holding position under missile fire while sweating and breathing smoke and dust tested endurance beyond ordinary limits. Combat injuries were common. Swords, spears, javelins, and arrows could pierce armor. Blunt trauma from shields or falling comrades caused lasting harm. Wounds often became infected. Amputations were rare and survival uncertain. The pain was constant, the risk omnipresent, and fear an unending companion. Even after victory, the aftermath was grueling. Bodies had to be burned or buried, wounded cared for with primitive medicine, and the march continued immediately to the next objective.
There was no respite. Campaigns could place soldiers in extreme environments. In Germany, dense forests, swamps, and cold winters created nearly insurmountable challenges. Soldiers waded through mud, endured frostbite, and faced ambush from tribes familiar with the terrain. In Britain, marshes and rain created endless damp misery. Soldiers' feet were constantly wet, shoes rotted, and trench foot became common. Hunger and disease compounded the misery, even in the absence of battle. In the Middle East and North Africa, heat and sand tested endurance differently. Water was scarce, sunburn rampant, and dehydration deadly. Soldiers improvised by digging wells, rationing water, and adjusting marching schedules, but survival remained precarious. The mental toll was as severe as the physical. Years of service meant separation from family and home. Letters were rare and communication slow. Loneliness, worry, and homesickness were constant. Soldiers learned to cope through camaraderie, superstition, and ritual. They prayed, sacrificed to gods, or participated in small ceremonies before and after battle. Tattoos or marks signified loyalty to a legion or unit, strengthening identity and morale. Songs, chants, and shared humor offered temporary relief, though it could not erase the weight of constant danger. Fear of punishment, both in camp and on the battlefield, was omnipresent. Soldiers who faltered faced flogging or decimation. Obedience was not optional, it was survival. Why endure such misery? The Roman army offered rewards, though distant and uncertain. Legionaries who survived a full 25 years of service received a pension, often a plot of land, a cash sum, and sometimes Roman citizenship if they were auxiliaries. For many, this promised security justified decades of relentless toil. Yet most soldiers never reached this reward. Illness, accidents, and battlefield death claimed thousands. Youth, strength, and vitality were spent long before any pension could be realized. The human cost was immense. Soldiers' bodies were broken by blisters, joint strain, infection, and injury. Minds were burdened by relentless stress, constant vigilance, and loss. Few could emerge from the service unchanged. Beyond combat, soldiers contributed to the empire in ways often overlooked. Roads, forts, aqueducts, and bridges were built by legionaries, not slaves. The construction demanded intelligence, endurance, and labor. Every mile of Roman road, every fort in Germania or Britain was a monument to the grinding reality of soldier life. Engineering required precision. Mistakes could be fatal. Tired soldiers could not compromise quality, yet exhaustion was constant. Even in construction, survival depended on strict routines, collective effort, and endurance. Soldiers were not merely warriors, they were builders, laborers, and caretakers of infrastructure under extreme pressure. Survival required cleverness. Soldiers learned to find food, purify water, treat wounds, and endure harsh weather. Improvisation saved lives. Bedding made from leaves, shelters from timber, rations stretched carefully. Comradeship and loyalty were equally crucial. Soldiers relied on one another to share rations, watch each other's backs, and carry the wounded. In a legion, survival was collective. No one endured alone. The Roman soldier's life was an unending cycle of exhaustion, danger, and discipline. Glory was rare, survival was relentless. Physical pain, mental strain, hunger, and fear were constants.
Yet the legions endured, building the empire and maintaining Rome's dominance across continents. The human capacity to obey, endure, and adapt was remarkable, but it came at the cost of youth, health, and sometimes identity. Even centuries later, the roads, forts, and walls still stand, a silent testament to human endurance under relentless structure. And still, one question persists. If survival demanded total obedience, relentless labour, and enduring danger for decades, what remained of the person beneath the armour? And could any man endure it without losing the essence of himself? If you were a plague doctor in 14th century Europe, life was a rhythm of dread, exhaustion, and constant exposure. You would rise not to the chirping of birds, but to the tolling of church bells, signals that the sick had multiplied, and that your day's work awaited. Your tools were simple and symbolic: a long-beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs, a cane to examine or prod patients without touching them, waxed robes to protect against bodily fluids, and sometimes surgical instruments that were crude by modern standards. You were an official of the city, sometimes appointed by the municipality, sometimes employed by families who could pay, and sometimes a volunteer stepping into a world no one else dared to enter. You would begin by collecting news of outbreaks, town criers, local clergy, or neighbours' reported illnesses, deaths, and suspicious boils. You carried a notebook, writing down names, locations, and symptoms, the earliest form of epidemiological tracking. Then you visited the sick. Every house, every hut, every street corner could hide the next infection. Your robes were thick, coated in wax, intended to prevent contact with miasma, the bad air, thought to cause disease. You inhaled the smells of herbs through your beaked mask, a small psychological comfort against the invisible killers around you. Inside homes, you encountered the realities of plague, feverish bodies, sores oozing dark fluids, delirious muttering, and families struggling to maintain basic hygiene. You carried your cane to examine without touching directly, but contamination was inevitable. The work was exhausting and monotonous. You travelled house to house, village to village, day after day, documenting, observing, sometimes performing rudimentary treatments, often delivering the final rites for those who would not survive. The tools of a plague doctor were more psychological than curative. The mask, long cloak, gloves, and cane created distance from the disease. The herbs in the beak, lavender, mint, cloves, were believed to purify the air. Sometimes doctors used leeches to balance humours or cut into buboes to drain infected fluids. Other treatments were purely ritualistic: prayers, charms, or fumigation with incense. Mortality remained high, and few patients survived without some combination of luck and natural immunity. The cane was both tool and weapon. You could lift bedding, prod the sick, or even ward off frightened relatives. It was also a constant reminder of the invisible threat lurking in every breath. Fear was as much a companion as plague itself. Townsfolk avoided plague doctors, simultaneously grateful and suspicious. Children hid families' whispered accusations of witchcraft or incompetence. Even other medical practitioners sometimes treated you with distrust. You were always aware of your own vulnerability. Exposure to the sick meant a high risk of contracting disease yourself. Many doctors died within weeks or months of their first cases. Others developed mild illness but survived, a mixture of chance, hygiene, and resilience. The monotony of work was punctuated by tragedy. Every day brought new deaths, new burials, and new fears. Each patient examined was a potential contagion, each visit a test of endurance, and each failure a reminder of human frailty. You rarely stayed in one place. Epidemics moved with populations, trade routes, and seasons. You could be summoned to neighbouring towns, across rivers, through forests, or along roads littered with corpses. Travel was slow, exhausting, and perilous. Roads were crowded with the sick and the fleeing, with scavengers, predators, and the risk of robbery adding to danger. Your accommodations were crude. You slept in barns, empty houses, or tents near the quarantine zones. Food was sparse, often cold and limited, carried from town to town. Sanitation was minimal, and exhaustion compounded the risk of infection. Endurance was more than physical. The mind was constantly tested. Watching patients deteriorate, knowing your interventions often did little, and confronting death daily could erode sanity. Many plague doctors developed rituals or superstitions to cope. Some recited prayers or chants, others carried charms or talismans. The beaked mask itself was as much a psychological shield as a physical one. Witnessing human suffering on such a scale created a unique isolation. Colleagues might fall ill, townsfolk feared you, and the dead accumulated faster than you could count. Your work became a relentless cycle of observation, record-keeping, rudimentary treatment, and mourning. While society relied on you, it also shunned you. Interaction with healthy populations was limited. Families hesitated to invite you into homes, and neighbours avoided contact. Loneliness was constant, a companion as oppressive as the smell of herbs or the sight of swollen blackened buboes. Despite this, some camaraderie existed among plague doctors themselves. They exchanged information about symptoms, treatments, and containment strategies. They developed a practical, if grim, network that helped track the spread of disease. Knowledge sharing was essential. Mistakes or ignorance could mean more death. Survival depended on preparation, observation, and endurance. Physical protection, waxed robes, gloves, and masks were imperfect, but offered some defense. Hygiene, washing hands and clothes when possible, though water was limited, reduced risk. Distance, using the cane and maintaining careful movement, minimized contact with fluids. Observation, keeping meticulous records, allowed for patterns to be noticed, sometimes slowing spread. Still, luck was crucial. Disease could strike despite every precaution. Even the most careful doctors succumbed, highlighting the fragility of human life amid epidemic. The plague's rhythm was cyclical and relentless. You treated patient after patient, village after village, with little variation. Epidemics returned seasonally or regionally, so no respite existed. Months, years, and decades could pass with little recognition, little reward, and constant exposure. You became a fixture of fear, mortality, and endurance, performing work vital to survival, yet shrouded in anonymity and dread. The life of a plague doctor was defined by monotony, risk, and repetitive suffering. It demanded endurance far beyond the ordinary. Yet without these doctors, tracking disease, caring for the sick, and attempting rudimentary treatment, mortality might have been even higher. Their existence illustrates a grim truth. Survival often depends on those willing to endure misery for the sake of others, even when recognition is rare and personal risk is constant. And still, one question lingers at the edge of every plague doctor's day. How does a human endure daily proximity to death, disease, and despair without losing themselves entirely to fear? If Section 1 revealed the daily horrors of a plague doctor, Section 2 examines how these doctors endured extended epidemics, developed practical strategies, and left an imprint on public health, often quietly, in the shadows of fear. Epidemics were not brief, they could linger for months, returning year after year. Survival required both physical stamina and psychological resilience. Plague doctors faced a relentless rhythm: morning inspections, patient visits, recording cases, rudimentary treatments, and burial supervision. Unlike soldiers or labourers, the threats were invisible. Disease could travel unseen, strike suddenly, and bypass protective measures. This uncertainty compounded exhaustion, as every step, every household could harbour infection. Doctors developed routines as coping mechanisms. They planned visits strategically, paced themselves during long treks, and maintained detailed logs. Even when overwhelmed, order offered a semblance of control. Without structure, fatigue and fear could become paralyzing. Observation was a central survival tool. Doctors meticulously noted symptoms, disease progression, and mortality rates. They recorded fevers, buboes, coughing, vomiting, and patterns in household contagion. These records allowed doctors to anticipate outbreaks, advise quarantine measures, and sometimes suggest rudimentary interventions. Observation also offered a psychological buffer, the sense that their work had purpose, that knowledge could save lives, even if only a few. The cumulative effect of decades of observation created an early form of epidemiology. Patterns in disease spread became apparent, guiding public health measures like isolation of the sick, disposal of corpses, and restrictions on movement. Plague treatments were crude but methodical. Doctors relied on humoral theory, balancing bodily fluids, and herbal remedies. Common practices included bloodletting or leeching to release excess humours, topical poultices made of herbs or vinegar applied to buboes, incense and fumigation to purify air within homes, isolation and quarantine, sometimes enforced through city ordinances. Most treatments were ineffective by modern standards, yet the act of intervention provided psychological relief to patients and families. Doctors sometimes used their cane to administer medicine or lift bedding without direct contact, reducing the risk of infection while performing their duties. Daily exposure to mortality shaped a plague doctor's mind. Witnessing death in waves demanded emotional adaptation. Some developed stoic detachment, treating the dead as part of the work rather than personal loss. Others relied on superstition, prayer, or ritual to maintain composure. Sleep was fitful. Doctors often rested near quarantine zones, with fear of contagion lurking in every breath. Nightmares, fatigue, and anxiety were constant companions, but camaraderie with other doctors and assistants provided a lifeline. Shared knowledge, small jokes, or brief discussions helped sustain mental health amid relentless pressure. Plague doctors often travelled between towns, responding to outbreaks wherever summoned. Mobility carried immense risk, but was necessary. They adapted by mapping safe routes, avoiding heavily infected areas when possible. Carrying essential supplies and herbal protection. Using masks, gloves, and waxed robes consistently. Relying on local assistance to handle tasks that brought them too close to disease. Despite precautions, infection was almost unavoidable over years of work. Survival depended on luck as much as skill, and the mortality rate among plague doctors was notoriously high. Plague doctors navigated a precarious social position. They were simultaneously vital and feared, necessary yet distrusted. Families sometimes welcomed them, with suspicion neighbours whispered of poison or incompetence. Clergy occasionally questioned their methods, and townsfolk sometimes accused them of hastening death. Endurance required psychological flexibility. Doctors learned to maintain authority while minimizing confrontation. They relied on city contracts, public ordinances, and civic recognition to legitimize their work, balancing fear with respect. Despite danger and misunderstanding, plague doctors contributed significantly to public health knowledge. Their records informed city officials, guiding quarantines to prevent spread between households or towns. Disposal of corpses to minimize secondary infection. Restrictions on markets, gatherings, and travel during outbreaks. Their observations allowed slow, iterative improvements, while treatments remained rudimentary. Structural interventions, isolation, sanitation, and record-keeping reduced contagion over time. In a world without germ theory, plague doctors represented one of the earliest forms of organized epidemic management. Their endurance turned chaos into data, fear into structured response, and helplessness into partial control. Extended epidemics magnified psychological strain. Doctors became accustomed to suffering, but never immune to despair. watching multiple generations succumb, witnessing families wiped out, and knowing that interventions often failed, created cumulative trauma. Many adopted routines to compartmentalize emotion. Mental detachment during visits. Ritualized cleansing after patient contact. Regular review of notes to maintain professional focus. These strategies allowed doctors to continue work over months and years, preserving both life, their own, and others, amid relentless adversity. Resilience depended on discipline, knowledge, and adaptability. Physical endurance, marching between outbreaks, performing manual labor, and wearing protective gear for hours. Mental endurance, accepting mortality as daily reality, maintaining focus on tasks, and compartmentalizing fear. Social navigation, gaining legitimacy through contracts, local laws, and alliances with civic authorities. Observation and record-keeping, turning chaos into structured knowledge, guiding prevention measures. These strategies were essential for survival, not just against disease, but against the psychological weight of relentless mortality. While battles and wars end, epidemics could stretch for years. Plague doctors existed in a monotony defined by death. Days blurred into one another. Patient visits, documentation, rudimentary treatments, burial supervision, travel, and exhaustion. Monotony did not dull danger. Disease was ever present, unpredictable, and invisible. Each day demanded vigilance, even when repetition threatened to desensitize the mind. Survival required constant awareness, flexibility, and endurance. The plague doctor's life demonstrates that human endurance is not only about strength or skill, but about adaptation, observation, and ritual. They confronted fear daily, endured repeated exposure to death, and contributed to survival on a community level despite minimal reward. Their work laid the foundations for epidemiology and public health. The strategies of observation, quarantine, and record-keeping foreshadowed scientific approaches developed centuries later. Yet, even in resilience, the question remains: how does a human continue to live among death daily without losing the capacity for compassion, curiosity, or hope? You have spent months or years as a plague doctor. You have walked the narrow streets of towns, the muddy lanes of villages, and the desolate roads between communities. You have carried the stench of disease, the fear of the populace, and the weight of death on your shoulders. Now, as we conclude this story, we explore what remained for society, for history, and for the individual. Epidemics came and went in waves. Each outbreak devastated towns, wiped out families, and destabilized economies. Plague doctors were on the front lines, confronting a persistent, invisible enemy. Although mortality remained high, their efforts influenced long-term survival. Cities began implementing more systematic responses. Quarantine zones around infected households. Cordons sanitaires to control travel. Disposal of corpses according to rudimentary hygienic principles. Recording and monitoring cases to identify patterns of spread. The direct interventions of plague doctors were often symbolic, but their observations laid the groundwork for systematic epidemic management. They transformed reactive fear into structured response. Despite limited understanding of disease transmission, plague doctors contributed indirectly to the evolution of public health. Their work introduced data-driven decision-making. Meticulous record-keeping enabled early statistical approaches to outbreaks. Preventive measures, the emphasis on separation, clothing barriers, and fumigation reduced exposure for communities and caregivers. Professional responsibility. The role became an early form of specialized medical occupation, illustrating the necessity of trained individuals to manage epidemics. Many practices, though primitive, anticipated later developments in sanitation, isolation, and epidemiology. The masks, robes, and canes were not merely theatrical, they represented early attempts
at minimizing contact and containing contagion. For the plague doctor, the price was high. Exposure often led to illness, permanent weakness, or death. Physical endurance was taxed by travel, protective gear, and exposure to filth. Psychological endurance was tested daily by the repetitive sight of suffering. Isolation and mistrust compounded the stress. Many doctors were shunned by their communities, feared by families, and criticized by peers. Their social position was precarious, essential, yet socially alienated. The mental weight was relentless. The cumulative effect of repeated exposure to death, helplessness, and fear could erode resilience. Yet some endured decades, relying on ritual, meticulous organization, camaraderie with colleagues, and an acceptance of mortality as part of daily life. Plague doctors developed practical and psychological strategies to survive. Ritualized hygiene, cleansing after visits to reduce risk and provide psychological comfort. Structured routines, pacing visits, keeping records, and segmenting time to maintain control amid chaos. Use of herbs and masks, both protective and symbolic, reinforcing the sense of agency. Collaboration, working with assistants, municipal authorities, and other doctors to share the burden of exposure. These strategies allowed them to maintain functionality, even when hope seemed distant and exhaustion overwhelming. Despite the grim realities, plague doctors embodied human resilience. Their work demanded courage, adaptability, and endurance. They faced daily fear, persistent danger, and the monotony of repeated failure, yet persisted, contributing to survival in ways invisible to contemporaries. Even in failure, they demonstrated the capacity of humans to endure extreme adversity. Their lives were reminders that survival is often less about heroism and more about steadfastness, structure, and the ability to bear unbearable circumstances. Recognition was rare. In many cases, plague doctors were remembered only in anecdote, legend, or municipal records. Their work was undervalued compared to the nobility, clergy, or victorious generals, despite being crucial to societal survival. Yet some cities formalized the role, paying wages, providing robes, and establishing official duties. Contracts and municipal appointments reflected the understanding that specialized human labor was necessary to manage disease, even if the broader public remained fearful or resentful. The endurance of plague doctors offers timeless lessons. Data and observation matter. Even imperfect records can guide effective intervention. Preparedness and structure reduce risk. Consistent routines and protective measures are critical. Psychological resilience is essential. Coping strategies for stress and fear enable long-term effectiveness. Invisible labor sustains society. Much of history's survival depends on individuals performing difficult, unglamorous work. Their lives remind us that managing crises is not only about discovery and treatment, but also about discipline, endurance, and consistent observation. For every life saved, countless doctors suffered physically and mentally. Many contracted the plague, others succumbed to exhaustion or psychological strain. Some retired into obscurity, carrying scars both visible and invisible. Their anonymity reflects a pattern in history. Those who endure the daily repetitive horrors of survival often leave no mark in grand narratives. Yet their impact is profound, shaping the health, survival, and stability of entire communities. Even the iconic beaked mask, now a symbol of medieval plague, represents the intersection of fear, ritual, and practical human endurance. The plague doctor's life was monotonous, exhausting, and perilous. They navigated a world dominated by death, disease, and societal fear, performing work essential to the survival of their communities. History remembers epidemics in numbers, deaths, recoveries, cities ravaged. But human endurance, resilience, and adaptation are harder to quantify. Plague doctors exemplify these qualities,
showing that survival depends as much on steadfastness, organization, and courage as on medical knowledge. Their story leaves one final question, quietly haunting every historical account. When the daily work of survival demands constant proximity to death and despair, how much of the self can endure, and what remains of humanity at the end of it all? Imagine being assigned a post where your companions are the wind, the waves, and the occasional seabird. The sea stretches endlessly in every direction, and storms crash relentlessly against the cliffs. You are a lighthouse keeper, responsible for a single beam of light that may mean life or death for ships navigating treacherous waters. Your day begins before sunrise. Even if the weather is calm, the job demands constant vigilance. A moment of inattention can result in disaster. Ships running aground, cargo lost, and lives perishing. Yet much of your work is repetitive and monotonous. Cleaning lamps, trimming wicks, refilling oil, polishing lenses, checking mechanisms, and maintaining the structure against the relentless salt and wind. Isolation is the defining feature of a lighthouse keeper's life. Some posts were on small rocky islands, reachable only by boat during favorable tides. You would live alone or with one or two assistants, months at a time. Supplies were limited and carefully rationed: food, water, fuel for lamps, and basic tools. Visits from the mainland were rare, often delayed by storms or rough seas. Letters from family arrived infrequently. The solitude could be crushing. Silence was constant, broken only by the roar of waves, the wind through the lighthouse tower, and the occasional gull overhead. Social interaction was minimal, making psychological resilience as crucial as physical endurance. Some keepers developed strict routines to maintain focus and sanity, structuring every hour of their day to prevent lethargy and despair. The core responsibility of a lighthouse keeper was keeping the light burning. This involved cleaning and polishing lenses and mirrors to maximize brightness. Even a thin layer of salt or soot could reduce visibility. Maintaining fuel supplies, oil or kerosene, had to be stored safely, measured precisely, and replenished regularly. Trimming wicks and adjusting flames, ensuring consistent light output, required constant attention. Monitoring weather conditions, storms could damage the structure or extinguish the light. Keepers kept journals detailing wind, tide, and visibility. Maintaining the building, repairs were ongoing. Salt and spray eroded metal, wood, and masonry. A small leak could become catastrophic in a storm. Repetition was constant. Day after day, month after month, the work demanded precision and endurance, even when the danger seemed distant. The sea is unpredictable. Calm waters can turn violent within hours. Storms could last days, with wind gusting to dangerous speeds and waves battering the lighthouse foundation. During these periods, keepers faced both physical danger and extreme stress. Maintaining the light under storm conditions could mean exposure to freezing rain, spray, and wind strong enough to knock a person off their feet. Even minor oversights could be fatal. A poorly maintained wick, a lens smudged by salt, or a door left unsecured could compromise the light, potentially causing shipwrecks. Every ship passing the coastline was a silent reminder of the stakes: human lives in your hands. Life on a remote lighthouse demanded meticulous rationing. Fresh water was limited and had to be stored carefully. Food consisted of preserved staples, salted meat, hard biscuits, canned goods, and whatever fishing provided. Fresh produce was rare and quickly spoiled in the salty air. Supply runs depended entirely on weather and tides. Storms could prevent deliveries for weeks, forcing keepers to conserve fuel, food, and water. Every resource became precious, and the monotony of rationing underscored the fragility of life in isolation. The combination of isolation, repetitive work, and constant responsibility weighed heavily on keepers. Without companions, amusement was scarce. Reading materials were limited, correspondence with family was slow. Social interaction was a luxury. Mental resilience was built through routine and purpose. Journaling, observing wildlife, and tracking weather provided structure. Some keepers created small rituals, polishing the lens at a set time, maintaining precise logs, or walking the perimeter at specific hours to impose order on the monotony. Loneliness could lead to despair. Some keepers suffered from depression, hallucinations, or anxiety due to extended isolation. A ship passing safely might bring satisfaction, but even this fleeting acknowledgement could not fully compensate for months of solitude. Where multiple keepers were assigned, relationships were complex. Cooperation was essential. One might maintain the light while another repairs the building. Trust was crucial. Mistakes could endanger everyone. Yet living in confined quarters with minimal privacy could create tension. Disagreements over duties, rationing, or maintenance became amplified. Psychological endurance was required to navigate interpersonal dynamics, just as much as it was to withstand storms and isolation. The most critical and mentally taxing periods were night watches. Darkness intensified the stakes. The light had to remain bright and visible across miles of turbulent water. Keepers rotated through shifts, sometimes standing for hours, performing routine checks while listening to the wind and the unseen currents. Sleep was often disrupted. A sudden extinguishing of the flame or an unusual sound could prompt immediate investigation. Even a minor lapse in vigilance carried consequences, making rest uneasy and constant awareness unavoidable. The life of a lighthouse keeper demonstrates that endurance is not only about surviving danger, but also about maintaining purpose through repetition and isolation. Survival required precision, discipline, and resilience against both the physical environment and the mental challenges of solitude. Keepers learned that the smallest tasks, cleaning a lens, trimming a wick, securing a door, could have far-reaching consequences. Each day's work was mundane, yet it had immense stakes. Human life depended on consistency and attention to detail, even in conditions that offered little recognition or reward. The lighthouse keeper's existence teaches a quiet, enduring lesson. Heroism is often hidden in monotonous vigilance, isolation, and disciplined repetition. Unlike soldiers or plague doctors, danger was indirect, but the mental and physical endurance required was no less demanding. Standing on a cliff, listening to the endless roar of the sea, maintaining a single beam of light through storms and solitude, a lighthouse keeper embodies human resilience in its most subtle and disciplined form. And still, one question remains, as constant as the waves themselves. How long can a human endure isolation, monotony, and silent responsibility before the mind itself begins to fray? If Section 1 introduced the physical and psychological challenges of life as a lighthouse keeper, Section 2 delves deeper into how these men, and occasionally women, endured months or years of isolation, monotony, and constant vigilance, developing routines, rituals, and coping mechanisms to survive both the environment and their own minds. For lighthouse keepers, survival depended on rhythm. Days were meticulously planned. Morning inspections, cleaning the lamp and lenses, refueling oil, maintaining the structure, checking instruments, recording weather data, and preparing meals. Every task was performed at a specific time to maintain a predictable pattern. Routine provided multiple benefits. Mental stability, repetition, and predictability mitigated the anxiety of isolation. Operational consistency ensured the light remained functional and hazards were avoided. Sense of control, amid the uncontrollable forces of the sea and weather, maintaining order in one's tasks offered psychological relief. Even small deviations from routine were carefully noted. Keepers would record every detail of the lighthouse's functioning, from the precise measurement of the oil reservoir to the alignment of the Fresnel lens. Monotony became a lifeline rather than a burden. Beyond work, lighthouse keepers developed personal rituals to stave off mental fatigue. Journaling, detailed logs of weather, light operations, and personal reflections served as both documentation and mental engagement. Observation of nature, tracking bird activity, tides, or cloud patterns offered distraction and a connection to life beyond the tower walls. Exercise and movement, climbing stairs, performing maintenance, or walking the perimeter provided physical activity to prevent stagnation. Reading and writing, books, letters, or personal reflections filled the long hours when weather prevented outdoor work. Some keepers created symbolic routines, lighting the lamp at precise times, polishing specific parts of the lens in a fixed order, or walking along the cliff edge before storms. These rituals anchored them psychologically, providing a sense of accomplishment and stability amid relentless isolation. Isolation amplified every mental challenge. Solitude could lead to anxiety, hallucinations, or depressive episodes. Loneliness was constant. Even brief human interaction, a visitor, a sailor, or a colleague, became a rare but significant event. Maintaining alertness while experiencing monotony required extraordinary discipline. The danger was constant yet subtle. One inattentive moment could extinguish the light, placing ships at risk. Sleep patterns were carefully managed to prevent fatigue, but vigilance could never fully relax. Some keepers reported feeling a heightened sensitivity to the sea's sounds, waves crashing against rocks, distant foghorns, the subtle creak of timbers under strain. Every noise could signify danger, demanding both alertness and emotional control. Monotony itself was a challenge. The work was repetitive, yet critical. Cleaning the lens, polishing metal, trimming wicks, and checking the oil supply might seem trivial, but any error could be catastrophic. To counter boredom and maintain focus, keepers often engaged in micro-challenges, timing themselves in completing a routine task, improving efficiency in maintenance procedures, observing patterns in tides, winds, or birds as a form of distraction. Even solitary hobbies, sketching the coastline, composing letters, or studying celestial navigation, became crucial tools for psychological endurance. Monotony, once mastered, provided a meditative rhythm, turning repetition into a stabilizing force. Where multiple keepers were assigned to a single station, interpersonal dynamics became a critical factor in survival. Working in close quarters for extended periods amplified minor conflicts. Disagreements over duties, maintenance priorities, or ration distribution could escalate quickly. Trust was essential. Mistakes or negligence by one keeper could imperil everyone. Cooperation, patience, and mutual respect became as important as technical skill. Successful teams often developed implicit routines and systems to divide labor efficiently, reducing both stress and risk. Even in moments of tension, shared responsibility and a common purpose, ensuring the light shone without fail, fostered solidarity, and minimized the dangers of interpersonal conflict. The environment was an ever-present adversary. Storms tested both physical endurance and mental fortitude. High winds, crashing waves, and icy spray demanded continuous maintenance of the lamp, structural reinforcement, and personal protection.
During severe weather, keepers performed tasks with incredible precision under extreme strain. The oil had to be kept flowing, lenses polished, and lamps refueled, even when waves threatened to breach the tower. Each successful night was a minor triumph, affirming their skill, vigilance, and resilience. Provisioning was a constant concern. Supplies were delivered infrequently, often delayed by storms. Keepers learned to ration meticulously. Oil and fuel were calculated to ensure uninterrupted lighting. Food and water were portioned for weeks in advance. Repairs were performed using spare materials, improvisation, or scavenged items. The mental discipline required to manage scarcity mirrored the monotony of daily duties. Every rationed meal, every careful measurement, and every repeated repair reinforced the delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. Some lighthouse keepers served decades in isolation, demonstrating remarkable endurance. Longevity depended on physical health, mental resilience, and the ability to adapt to extreme monotony. Those who survived often developed a deep attunement to the environment, reading storms, tides, and wind patterns with near-intuitive precision. This expertise was crucial. Mariners relied on the lighthouse as a beacon of safety, and the keeper's vigilance literally saved lives. Yet recognition was minimal. The heroism of the lighthouse was subtle, measured not in battle or dramatic intervention, but in quiet consistency, discipline, and the prevention of disaster. The life of a lighthouse keeper illustrates human endurance in its most subtle form. Unlike soldiers or plague doctors, the dangers were indirect, but monotony, isolation, and responsibility demanded resilience of body and mind. Each polished lens, trimmed wick, and logged observation represented a small act of heroism. Success was measured not in applause, but in the unbroken shining of a single beam across treacherous waters. And still, one question lingers amid the crashing waves and endless horizon. When a human endures months or years of solitude and repetitive labor, tasked with life or death responsibility, how does the mind preserve both sanity and purpose? You have spent months, perhaps years, atop a lonely cliff, watching the waves batter rocks far below. You have kept the lamp burning, maintained the structure, and documented every detail of wind, tide, and storm. You have survived long stretches of isolation, repetitious labor, and constant vigilance. Now, the story of the lighthouse keeper reaches its conclusion, not with grand triumph, but with the quiet legacy of endurance and the personal toll of a life lived at the edge of the world. Isolation shapes humans in ways both subtle and profound. For lighthouse keepers, solitude was constant, punctuated only by rare visits from supply boats or infrequent correspondence with family. Months of minimal human contact, heightened sensitivity to every sound, waves crashing against rocks, the wind rattling the tower, or the creak of old timbers under strain. Extended solitude could lead to psychological stress, anxiety, depression, and in extreme cases, hallucinations were reported by keepers throughout history. Many developed intricate routines to maintain mental stability, maintaining meticulous logs, timing daily tasks, and creating small rituals of precision in lamp maintenance or structural upkeep. Some keepers cultivated hobbies, reading, writing letters, sketching the coastline, or recording observations about wildlife to stave off mental fatigue. These pursuits were not just leisure, they were essential coping mechanisms, blending mindfulness with distraction. The environment was unforgiving. Constant exposure to salt spray, wind, rain, and sun eroded both structures and bodies. Tasks that required climbing stairs or ladders with fuel cleaning lenses, or performing repairs demanded stamina. Even small injuries could become serious in isolation, as medical attention was often days away. Storms were particularly dangerous. High winds, waves crashing over platforms, and freezing temperatures challenged even the fittest keepers. They learned to endure discomfort, pain, and fatigue, performing vital duties while soaked, chilled, or exhausted. The work was repetitive yet unforgiving, a delicate balance between survival and failure. Despite monotony, lighthouse keepers became experts in maritime navigation and environmental observation. Years of daily observation enabled keepers to anticipate storms, read tidal changes, and predict maritime hazards. Their logs, sometimes spanning decades, provided valuable historical records of weather patterns and oceanic behavior. The human mind, sharpened by routine, became attuned to subtleties of wind direction, cloud formations, and the subtle behavior of waves. Such expertise allowed keepers to prevent shipwrecks. Mariners relied on the reliability of a single light, and the keeper's diligence meant countless lives and cargoes remained safe. Interestingly, despite the life-saving importance of their work, lighthouse keepers were often invisible to the wider public. Recognition was rare and typically limited to maritime authorities. Their heroism was measured in the absence of disaster, in ships arriving safely at ports, rather than in applause or fame. Some keepers were commemorated locally, perhaps with mentions in shipping logs or minor municipal honors, but the majority remained anonymous. They performed the same laborious tasks day after day, enduring monotony and isolation for decades without societal acknowledgement. Even their failures, the occasional shipwreck due to malfunction, human error, or environmental extremes, were often remembered more vividly than successes. The burden of responsibility was both constant and silent. The monotony that defined the keeper's life became a tool for survival. Repetition provided stability, rituals created psychological anchors. Daily routines were structured with almost obsessive precision, trimming wicks, cleaning lenses, refueling lamps, inspecting railings, and repairing masonry. Many keepers developed personal rituals, marking hours with small observances, pacing the perimeter, or repeating maintenance tasks in specific sequences. These habits provided a sense of control, even as the ocean and weather remained unpredictable. Isolation also fostered introspection. Keepers often reflected on mortality, purpose, and the fragility of human life. Solitude encouraged endurance, not just of body, but of mind, cultivating resilience against boredom, fear, and psychological strain. The lighthouse keeper's story teaches several profound lessons. Endurance often manifests quietly. Unlike soldiers or explorers, their heroism was hidden, defined by consistency rather than dramatic feats. Routine and structure preserve mental stability. Amid monotony, deliberate rituals can prevent despair. Attention to detail saves lives. Even repetitive, mundane tasks can have consequences far beyond the individual. Isolation tests the mind as much as the body. Mental resilience is a critical component of human survival. Keepers demonstrate that enduring repetitive, high-stakes work in isolation requires more than stamina. It demands foresight, discipline, and psychological adaptation. While not recorded in grand histories, lighthouse keepers shaped maritime safety profoundly. Their diligence reduced shipwrecks, safeguarded trade routes, and ensured the survival of countless sailors. Historical records and maritime logs, preserved over centuries, offer glimpses into their meticulous work and the quiet impact of their labor. Some lighthouses became symbols of continuity and reliability. Generations of sailors trusted that a light would appear on dark nights, guiding them through treacherous waters. The keeper's labor, often invisible, sometimes forgotten, ensured that this trust was justified. Yet every triumph carried a personal cost. Long-term isolation could strain mental health, disrupt family relationships, and erode social bonds. Many keepers retired with a mixture of pride, exhaustion, and quiet melancholy, having spent decades in solitude performing work of immense societal value. Physical ailments were common: arthritis from repetitive labor, back and joint strain, skin damage from constant exposure, and illness from harsh weather. Some succumbed to accidents during maintenance or storms. The dangers of a lighthouse were subtle but relentless. Psychologically, keepers learned to compartmentalize fear and loneliness. The mind became a tool of survival, adapting to monotony, danger, and isolation. Few histories capture these internal battles, yet they were as vital as any physical task performed atop cliffs or rocky islands. The lighthouse keeper's life is a testament to quiet heroism and the endurance of humans in extreme conditions. While their dangers were not immediately dramatic, the stakes were high. The survival of sailors depended on their vigilance. Repetition, isolation, and exposure tested both mind and body. Their legacy endures not just in lighthouses, but in the principles of human endurance they exemplified. Attention to detail, ritualized routine, and resilience under isolation remain relevant today, illustrating the profound capacity of humans to sustain life and prevent disaster under monotonous and difficult circumstances. And still, one final question persists, echoing across centuries and crashing waves. When survival demands constant attention, repetitive labor, and isolation at the edge of the world, how does the human spirit endure, and what quietly survives of the self amid decades of solitude and responsibility? Imagine standing knee-deep in mud, gripping a spade, sweat running into your eyes as the sun beats down, or rain soaks through your clothes, that every movement is a struggle. You are a canal worker in 18th or 19th century Europe, assigned to carve waterways that will forever shape trade, transport, and the economy. Yet your life is repetitive, exhausting, and largely invisible to history. Canals were the lifelines of industry before railways and modern roads. They connected factories to ports, mines to markets, and villages to growing towns. Each stretch of water required immense labor to excavate, stabilize, and maintain. Canals were marvels of engineering, but they were built and maintained by ordinary people, enduring extraordinary monotony and physical strain. A canal worker's day began before sunrise. Workers were often local peasants or itinerant laborers, paid minimally for grueling labor. The work site was typically a muddy trench, lined with rudimentary scaffolding or embankments. Tools were simple: shovels, pickaxes, wheelbarrows, and occasionally rudimentary pulleys or carts to move excavated earth. Before work began, supervisors, sometimes engineers with minimal training, assigned tasks. One group dug, another reinforced banks, while a third transported soil. Coordination was vital, but oversight was minimal. Mistakes, collapses, or accidents could be deadly. Workers relied on experience, endurance, and an almost instinctual understanding of the Earth's behavior. Excavation was unrelenting. Workers dug by hand, lifting wet, heavy soil from trenches. Water had to be managed constantly. Rain could fill a canal within hours, slowing progress, while dry periods hardened the earth, making shoveling nearly impossible. Work was cyclical, repetitive, and punishing. Hours were spent digging, moving earth, reinforcing banks, or clearing debris. Breaks were minimal, meals sparse. The monotony was broken only by the occasional slip, collapse, or accidental injury, events that were common in the damp, uneven terrain. Work demanded both physical strength and endurance. Muscle fatigue, blisters, and exposure to waterborne illnesses were constant threats. Footwear was rudimentary, workers often stood in mud and water for hours. Skin infections, frostbite in winter, and heat stroke in summer were daily hazards. Weather dictated every aspect of work. Storms could halt progress, washing away days of labor. Extreme heat sapped energy, while cold and wet conditions brought near constant discomfort. Workers endured wind, mud, and biting insects, all while maintaining concentration and avoiding accidents. The canals themselves were treacherous. Unstable banks could collapse, trapping workers. Deep water presented drowning hazards, particularly for inexperienced laborers. Tools were blunt, heavy, and often dangerous, increasing the risk of injury. Beyond physical danger, workers confronted monotony. Digging a trench that stretched miles, day after day, required mental fortitude. The repetitive rhythm of shoveling, lifting, and transporting soil became both exhausting and hypnotic. Survival required consistency and focus. One misstep could endanger life or halt progress. Canal construction sites were highly stratified. Supervisors or engineers monitored progress, ensured payment schedules, and sometimes directed laborers' tasks, though their understanding of physical work was often theoretical. Skilled laborers, those adept at reinforcing banks, operating rudimentary cranes, or managing water flow, earned slightly higher wages. The majority of laborers were unskilled, performing back-breaking work for minimal pay. Mistreatment, strict oversight, and the ever-present threat of injury reinforced social hierarchies. Compliance was essential. Disobedience or negligence could lead to fines, dismissal, or, in extreme cases, injury from punitive measures. A camaraderie among laborers provided a fragile buffer. Shared hardship forged bonds, jokes in mud, mutual support during storms, and informal rituals at meal breaks helped preserve morale. Yet these bonds were fragile, constantly tested by exhaustion, hunger, and harsh conditions. Food was basic and minimal. Workers typically subsisted on bread, salted meat, and whatever vegetables were available. Meals were hurried, often eaten standing in muddy fields. Water was drawn from canals or local wells, frequently contaminated, contributing to the spread of disease. Sustenance was as much psychological as physical. Meals offered brief respite, a momentary break from repetitive labor and exposure to the elements. Yet the monotony of diet mirrored the monotony of work, underscoring the relentless, grinding nature of life along the canal. Canal work was hazardous. Waterborne diseases, dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were constant threats. Wounds became infected quickly in muddy, unsanitary conditions. Chronic back pain, joint damage, and exhaustion were common, often persisting long after workers left the site. Even minor injuries could end careers, or, worse, lead to death. Laborers worked continuously, despite pain, driven by economic necessity and social pressure. Survival demanded physical endurance, awareness of environmental dangers, and relentless commitment to routine. Mental resilience was as important as physical stamina. Repetitive labor in harsh conditions could erode morale. Workers developed coping mechanisms, chanting while digging, pacing with rhythm, and forming small rituals around meals, breaks, or tool maintenance. These practices provided structure and a sense of control. Even in monotonous labor, humans sought patterns, milestones, and small victories. Completing a trench, reinforcing a bank, or moving a particularly heavy load became markers of achievement, sustaining both morale and physical momentum. Despite invisibility in grand historical narratives, canal workers' labor reshaped the economic and geographic landscape. Canals facilitated trade, enabled industrial growth, and connected communities in ways that railroads and roads later built upon. Each trench dug, embankment reinforced, and lock constructed contributed to economic expansion. Yet the workers themselves were largely forgotten. Their endurance, precision, and willingness to labor in extreme conditions enabled infrastructure that outlasted individual lifetimes. The canals became monuments to collective human perseverance, even if the laborers themselves were absent from the historical spotlight. The canal worker's life exemplifies a quiet form of heroism, enduring monotony, physical strain, and environmental danger without recognition or reward. Their labor demonstrates how human survival and societal progress often rely on repetitive, unnoticed work performed under harsh conditions. And yet one final thought lingers, echoing across the endless mud and water. When life is defined by repetitive, high-risk labor with little recognition and constant exposure to danger, how do humans sustain both body and spirit? And what of their endurance remains in history when their names are lost to time? If Section 1 described the grueling physical labor and monotony of canal work, Section 2 explores how laborers endured extended projects, developed techniques to manage physical strain, fostered camaraderie, and adapted mentally to survive months or years of repetitive, high-risk labor. Canal construction was rarely brief. Projects could stretch for months, even years. Workers faced the same muddy trenches, repetitive digging, and exposure to elements day after day, week after week. Progress was slow. A single mile of canal could require thousands of laborers moving tons of earth manually. Extended timelines magnified challenges. Workers dealt not only with physical exhaustion, but also with persistent weather extremes. Rain could flood trenches overnight, undoing days of effort. Heat and sun exposure sapped strength, while winter's frost and ice stiffened muscles and cracked hands. Monotony compounded fatigue. The repetitive rhythm of digging, lifting, and transporting soil became mentally taxing. Days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. Mental endurance became as critical as physical strength, with focus and discipline determining survival, productivity, and even safety. Canal workers developed strategies to maximize efficiency and reduce personal strain. Experienced laborers learned to leverage body mechanics, using legs rather than back to lift soil, adjusting spade angles to minimize fatigue. Use teamwork, coordinating shoveling, soil transport, and embankment reinforcement to optimize workflow. Improve soil management, staging earth removal to prevent rework during rain or flooding, arranging wheelbarrow routes efficiently, and reinforcing banks in advance. Pace labor, alternating intensity with slower tasks, conserving energy while maintaining output. These techniques were learned through experience and observation. Mistakes could lead to injury, collapse of banks, or delays. Knowledge was often shared informally, passed between laborers or across generations of workers. Managing water was central to survival and progress. Canals, by definition, involved controlling water flow in addition to excavating earth. Workers constructed temporary dams, sluices, and channels to divert water, prevent flooding, and maintain work areas. This required constant attention. A sudden rainstorm could compromise embankments, erode newly dug trenches, and create drowning hazards. Laborers adapted by creating temporary sandbag barriers, wooden reinforcements, or makeshift drainage systems. These innovations were often born of necessity, reflecting practical intelligence developed in harsh, hands-on conditions. Extended projects fostered tight bonds among laborers. Shared hardship created solidarity. Jokes, informal competitions, and shared meals strengthened morale. Workers often created small rituals, for instance, marking progress along a trench, celebrating the completion of a particularly difficult section, or assisting injured colleagues. Camaraderie also served. These innovations were often born of necessity, reflecting practical intelligence developed in harsh, hands-on conditions. Extended projects fostered tight bonds among labourers. Shared hardship created solidarity. Jokes, informal competitions, and shared meals strengthened morale. Workers often created small rituals, for instance, marking progress along a trench, celebrating the completion of a particularly difficult section, or assisting injured colleagues. Camaraderie also served practical purposes. Teams relied on mutual trust. One person steadied a wheelbarrow, another reinforced a bank, and a third coordinated water diversion. A lapse in cooperation could lead to injury or delay, so social cohesion became a survival tool as much as an emotional support system. Repetition, exposure, and danger required mental adaptation. Labourers developed coping mechanisms. Rhythmic chanting or singing, coordinated with digging, this maintained energy and focus. Micro-goals. Breaking the project into small segments or focusing on individual tasks prevented overwhelm. Observation and problem solving. Constantly reading terrain, water levels, and weather patterns kept the mind engaged. Reflection and journaling. Some workers recorded progress, weather, or personal experiences, providing psychological structure and purpose. These mental strategies transformed monotony into a manageable rhythm, allowing labourers to maintain both focus and endurance across extended projects. Extended exposure to mud, water, and sun created chronic health challenges. Skin infections, rheumatism, blisters, and back injuries were common. Some workers developed preventative habits, changing soaked clothing when possible, massaging sore muscles, or alternating tasks to reduce repetitive strain. Disease was a constant threat. Contaminated water contributed to dysentery, cholera, and typhoid outbreaks. Labourers learned to manage water sources carefully, boil drinking water when possible, and maintain hygiene practices within the limits of the environment. Despite precautions, illness could halt work, end employment, or cause death. Survival required vigilance, discipline, and constant adaptation. Over time, monotony itself became a tool for survival. Workers used repetition to develop efficiency and expertise. Muscle memory improved speed, coordination, and accuracy, while routine minimized cognitive strain. Monotony also allowed labourers to focus on incremental progress. Completing a single trench, moving a particular mound of soil, or reinforcing a section of embankment became tangible milestones, providing psychological reinforcement. These small victories maintained morale and a sense of purpose. Extended labour fostered acute observational skills. Labourers became attuned to soil texture, moisture levels, and subtle changes in embankment stability. They learned to predict structural failure, anticipate water seepage, and adjust techniques before disasters occurred. Observation extended to weather and environment as well. Labourers tracked rainfall, wind patterns, and tidal movements to plan work and prevent hazards. This practical intelligence, honed in extreme monotony, ensured safety, productivity, and long-term project success. Though largely invisible in historical accounts, canal workers shaped the economic landscape. Each mile of canal facilitated trade, connected communities, and enabled industrial growth. Their labour laid the foundation for transportation networks that persisted for generations. Their endurance, skill, and adaptability ensured that these waterways were functional, durable, and safe. The work was invisible but indispensable, a quiet backbone of economic progress. The canal worker's life demonstrates endurance under extreme monotony, physical strain, and environmental challenge. Survival required not only physical strength, but mental adaptation, social cohesion, and innovative problem-solving.
quiet heroism emerges from persistence, discipline, and resilience in the face of unrelenting repetition and hardship. The labor may seem invisible, yet its impact endures, shaping societies and economies long after the individual is forgotten. And still, one question remains. When humans endure extended, repetitive labor under constant risk, with little recognition and extreme monotony, how do they maintain focus, hope, and purpose, and what survives of their effort in history beyond the canals themselves? You have spent months, perhaps years, standing in mud, lifting soil, reinforcing banks, and navigating waterlogged trenches. Your hands are calloused, your back aches, and the monotony presses on the mind as heavily as the physical labor presses on the body. Yet your work is essential, each canal dug, each lock reinforced, and each mile cleared transforms the landscape, reshapes trade, and sustains communities. Now, as this story concludes, we examine the legacy of canal workers, the personal toll of their labor, and the quiet heroism embedded in infrastructure built by unseen hands. The canals these laborers built revolutionized commerce and transportation. They connected towns to ports, mines to markets, and factories to suppliers. Without canals, the early stages of industrialization in Europe and North America would have been severely hampered. Goods that now traveled efficiently by barge were once transported with great difficulty overland, at higher cost and risk. Every mile of waterway required meticulous excavation, embankment reinforcement, lock construction, and water management. The work of thousands of laborers over decades enabled smoother transport, reduced losses of cargo, and expanded trade networks. Entire industries, textiles, coal, timber, and grain, depended on the waterways carved by these workers' sweat and endurance. Yet these contributions rarely entered historical narratives. Engineers, investors, and industrialists received recognition, while the laborers whose persistent physical work made it all possible remained largely invisible. Their legacy was functional rather than celebratory. Canals endured, shaping societies silently, while the workers themselves disappeared from the record. The cost of canal construction was immense. Chronic injuries were common: joint and back pain from repetitive lifting, muscle strain, frostbite, heat exhaustion, and infections from standing in stagnant water. Footwear and clothing offered little protection, exposing workers to cuts, blisters, and exposure-related illnesses. Disease was an ever-present danger. Contaminated water contributed to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Even minor injuries, left untreated in unsanitary conditions, could become life-threatening. The physical toll of long projects left many laborers permanently weakened, with ailments persisting long after work ended. Despite these dangers, laborers endured, driven by necessity. Payment was modest, often insufficient to support families, yet work could not be abandoned. Survival demanded discipline, endurance, and attention to both physical safety and repetitive task efficiency. Monotony, isolation, and the repetitive nature of canal labor exerted profound mental strain. Workers faced weeks of the same tasks, in the same mud and water, under the same sky. Boredom could erode focus, yet vigilance was essential. A lapse could lead to bank collapse, injury, or project delay. Laborers developed psychological adaptations. They measured progress through small achievements, like completing a trench section or reinforcing a lock successfully. Rituals, coordinated chants, pacing during work, or informal competitions provided mental structure and camaraderie. Reflection and observation of the environment offered mental engagement beyond mere survival. Even amidst monotony, workers cultivated resilience. They endured repetitive labor and environmental hazards not for fame, but because their labor mattered to communities, economies, and lives that depended on reliable waterways. While much of canal work was manual, laborers were often inventive. They devised simple yet effective methods to manage soil, water, and embankments. Makeshift barriers, improvised drainage channels, and coordinated teamwork reduced risk and improved efficiency. These adaptations were not recorded in official engineering plans but were crucial to project success. Practical knowledge, passed between workers, allowed projects to proceed despite limited technology, unpredictable weather, and challenging terrain. The canal's durability and functionality depended as much on these practical skills as on the designs of engineers. Social bonds were critical for enduring long-term projects. Shared hardship fostered cooperation and trust. Workers relied on each other to lift heavy loads, stabilize embankments, or respond to accidents. Humor, storytelling, and small daily rituals helped maintain morale. Even minor acts of assistance, sharing food, offering encouragement, helping an injured colleague, became essential for both physical survival and mental endurance. Camaraderie transformed repetitive labor into